Hey everyone, Cam here. So today I thought it'd be fun to do a TikTok response video. In the video, we'll be taking a look at TikToker Jordan the Grey Witch says that God's not real because there's no evidence for God. The video is only 60 seconds long, so we'll actually watch the whole thing first and then deconstruct each part.
Also, God's not real.
That comment section is absolutely filled with people fighting over the semantics of that statement. Now, while in science, anyone who is making an assertion would have to provide evidence to support that claim, no God claim has ever been substantiated. Ever. And saying there is no evidence to support the existence of a God or deity doesn't quite have the same ring to it. So until anyone can provide any tangible evidence to support a God claim, it won't be entertained. Now, while the absence of evidence isn't necessarily the evidence of absence, in the claim of a truly omnipotent, omniscient deity, the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence.
Okay, so for a little context, the very first comment that Jordan makes where she says God's not real comes from a different video. In that video, she is responding to a Muslim commenter that says that hellfire comes from the sun. In her original video, she explains that there's actually no fire on the sun, and then at the end kind of just tags on, also God's not real. Some folks started giving her pushback in the comments on her claim that God's not real, and that's when she decided to make a follow-up video where she explains her thoughts in more detail. That's where the video we just played comes in. Now, obviously, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Christian, so I'm not here to defend the claim that hellfire comes from the sun or anything like that. Rather, what I'd like to do is evaluate what she says in defense of her original claim that God's not real. So in the video we just watched, Jordan's response has two key parts. First, she says that there's no evidence to support the existence of God. That's part one. Second, she says that when it comes to an omnipotent and omniscient being, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. That's part two. So off the bat, I want to acknowledge that if she's right about these two parts, then it just follows logically that we have evidence against God's existence. But that's where things get interesting, because I don't think that either part is true. Let's take the second part first. Remember, the second part says that in the case of an all-powerful, all-knowing God, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. But why should anyone actually think that? What Jordan might be thinking is that an all-powerful, all-knowing God would be able to provide good evidence for its existence. And I think we can grant that. An omnipotent being could do that. But the question is, why? Why should we think that a being would want to do that? I mean, maybe this being has good reasons to remain hidden. The typical response at this point is to say that a perfectly good being wouldn't want to remain hidden. A good parent doesn't want to remain hidden from their children, right? Even more so in the case of a perfectly good God. A perfectly good being would want to reveal its existence. But where I think this analogy starts to break down is that a good parent might have reasons to remain hidden from their children, at least for a little while. So for example, suppose that the child hates the parent and wants nothing to do with them. In this case, I think the parent is actually justified in remaining distant. Forcing themselves upon the child might be counterproductive. It might result in the child hating the parent even more. But what about children that would be open to a relationship with the parent? Wouldn't a good parent reveal themselves if they knew the child wanted to be with them? Now, in this case, I think we should grant that a good human parent would do this. But I don't think it follows that a good God would necessarily do this. Here's why. Just as Jordan said, God is omniscient. God knows infallibly what's best for us. And what's best for us might involve God being hidden, at least for a period of time. Okay, let's go a bit deeper here. Christian philosopher Dr. Dustin Crummett has argued that God wants us to relate to each other and to God through community. through activities like studying scriptures together, working on and thinking through rational arguments, encouraging each other in spiritual disciplines, participating in corporate worship, and setting good moral examples for each other, we can help each other learn more about and grow closer to God. And this responsibility is extremely valuable. Using it correctly helps us form deeper, more meaningful relationships with God and other people. And if all this is true, then it seems that God actually has good reason to remain distant, even in cases where someone wants more evidence. And I should mention that before moving on, that what we've been discussing here is the so-called argument from divine hiddenness. There's a rich literature that exists on this argument. The reason that I've offered from the good of community is just one among many that are currently being discussed by philosophers of religion. If you'd like to learn more about this argument or this particular response, check the description. I've got loads of links and resources to assist you in your search for truth. I say all of this to say I'm not convinced that when it comes to God, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Seems plausible that God has good reason to remain hidden, at least for a period of time. Also note that one could just accept the view that absence of evidence is evidence of absence in the case of God, but just hold that we have ample evidence for God's existence. That's an entirely appropriate view to hold as a theist. All right. Having addressed the second part of her video, let's now turn to the first part, where she claims that there's no evidence for God.
No God claim has ever been substantiated. Ever.
So yeah, the claim in the second part is kind of understandable. I can understand why someone might expect a loving God to provide more evidence for his existence than he in fact has. I think there's plausible reasons that sort of lessen this expectation, like the one I mentioned from the good of community, but I can see why someone might nevertheless think that God should be more obvious. That's like understandable. But this claim that there's no evidence for God is not to be taken seriously. It's not a serious objection to theism. And by the way, I've got an entire response video dedicated to this particular atheist objection already. If you'd like to learn or hear more of my thoughts on this objection, check the description. Now, instead of rehearse what I've already said in other videos, I thought it'd be helpful to summarize one of the latest and strongest pieces of evidence for the existence of God. Then at the end of this video, I'll mention some key resources if you'd like to investigate other strong pieces of evidence for God at a deeper level. Okay. Back to the evidence. So Dr. Dustin Crummett, the same guy I mentioned earlier, has co-written a peer-reviewed paper with Dr. Brian Cutter, another great Christian philosopher, on what they call the argument from psychophysical harmony. The basic idea behind the argument is that mental states and physical states correlate with each other in really harmonious ways. And this harmony that exists between the physical and the mental is strong evidence for theism. Here's a quick analogy to help you understand how the argument works. Suppose that you take your car into the shop one day for some routine maintenance, like an oil change. A couple minutes into the job, the mechanic comes out shocked and says to you, "How have you been driving this car around? It has no steering column." You come out and look, and sure enough, your car has no steering column. But what's odd and what no one can explain is that your steering wheel still moves the tires left and right just like a normal car. There's automotive harmony between the way you move your steering wheel and the way in which your wheels turn. And this is more or less the situation we find ourselves in when it comes to the physical and the mental. The mental is the analog for the steering wheel, and the physical is the analog for the wheels. If these two things are, in fact, disconnected, it's actually really difficult to explain why the two correlate in such fortunate ways. Now, something you might want to say already is that the mental and the physical are causally connected. In other words, it's not the case that there's no steering column. Problem solved, right? Wrong. The argument still works even if we assume that there is a causal connection between the physical and the mental. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The automotive analogy is only meant to help you initially grasp the argument. To really appreciate the force of this argument, we need to spend some time understanding the concept of psychophysical harmony. As I've said, psychophysical harmony is basically the fact that mental states correlate with physical states in really favorable ways. One example of this kind of harmony is called hedonic harmony. I'll explain this type of harmony with a story. So a few weeks ago, I was mountain bike riding with my brother and a friend, and about halfway through the ride, we came up on a big U-shaped hill. U-shaped, like that. You basically ride down a really steep hill and then up another really steep hill. Well, so here I go riding down the steep part of the hill, the down part. That part went fine, but about halfway up the second hill, I realized that I didn't have enough speed to make it all the way to the top. And I tried to bail, but I ended up falling backwards, like over my bike and tumbling down the hill. And I landed at the bottom and hit my head really hard on the ground. And it was actually such a hard impact that it broke the back part of my helmet. And I didn't get like a concussion or anything. At least I don't think I did. But it was pretty scary. And needless to say, I haven't been back to that part of the trail. Well, what does all this have to do with hedonic harmony? Excuse me. Well, let's break this down. So in my situation, when I fell and hit my head, that caused a biochemical reaction in my brain, call this the physical state, which in turn caused me to experience pain, call this the mental state, which in turn made it rational for me to avoid that hill in the future. There's nothing really remarkable about that, right? Like we have a physical state, a mental state, a rational decision to avoid similar negative experiences in the future. Check, check, check. But what if things were different? Like what if when I fell down and hit my head, I experienced pleasure instead of pain? Let's suppose that all of the physical facts remain the same. I fell, hit my head, that caused biochemical reactions in my brain, which led to the same avoidance behavior in the future. But instead of feeling pain in that situation, I experienced pleasure. Again, all that's being changed in this scenario is the resulting mental state. Well, in that case, even though the physical facts would make me avoid that behavior in the future, I would have good reason to pursue that behavior in the future. Why? Because that experience gave me pleasure. The fact that our physical states and our mental states align in ways that make our behaviors rational is not something we would just expect to happen by chance. Indeed, most of the possible ways of pairing states of consciousness with physical states of your brain would lead to widespread disharmony, a situation in which our behaviors are not made rational by our conscious experiences. But in our world, this kind of disharmony is the exception. It's not the rule. And this cries out for explanation. We wouldn't just expect a car with no steering column to function perfectly by chance. That's the situation in which we find ourselves. In their paper, Dr. Crummett and Dr. Cutter include other examples of psychophysical harmony. If you want to go check those out, I've got the PDF linked in the description. But hopefully what I've just explained here helps you understand the problem. Okay, now let's return to the question of whether the problem disappears if we posit a causal connection between the mental and the physical. Does that work? Not exactly. So even if we posit a connection between the two, that doesn't mean that the connection will be harmonious. It could be that the connection is disharmonious. So one way to think about the problem is that conceivably, something other than pain could have played the causal role that pain plays in the actual world. So in the actual world, in this world, the mental experience of pain causes us to avoid painful stimuli, right? That's normal. But other mental experiences could have caused the same avoidance behavior. For example, imagine if a certain sensation akin to like TV static had played this role. In that case, bodily injury would have caused feelings of static, and feelings of static would have caused avoidance behavior. But in that case, the mental-physical connection wouldn't have been harmonious. It's experiencing static doesn't make it rational to avoid damaging stimuli. So the question is, why do physical states and mental states align so well in the actual world? Why do they align in ways that make our behaviors rational? So let's go back to the automotive analogy. If the steering column isn't connected in exactly the right way, turning the steering wheel to the right could result in the wheels turning to the left. It could result in the wheels just sort of wobbling back and forth. It's not enough to posit a causal connection. The connection has to be precise. One might even say it has to be fine-tuned for harmony. Now, you might be wondering how this leads to God. I'm glad you asked. Basically, the way that this leads to the existence of God is that if atheism is true, it's really difficult to see what could explain psychophysical harmony. Of all the possible ways the mental and the physical could relate to each other, most of those ways are disharmonious. And since atheism is just the view that no gods exist, it doesn't actually predict psychophysical harmony. But on the other hand, if theism is true, this kind of harmony is not nearly as surprising. Designers of cars want steering wheels and wheels to align in ways that make rational sense. Similarly, designers of conscious creatures want mental and physical states to align in ways that make rational sense. Another way of looking at this is that psychophysical harmony is valuable and God brings about valuable states of affairs. But ultimately, psychophysical harmony is very strong evidence for theism over atheism. You might be thinking, what about evolution? Couldn't evolution by natural selection explain psychophysical harmony? No. Evolution might explain why our bodies move around in the way that they do. For example, natural selection explains why our brains respond to tissue damage by causing avoidance behavior. But evolution doesn't explain why those brain processes are associated with a subjective experience that makes that avoidance behavior rationally justified. Going back to the example discussed earlier, evolution could have worked just fine if most or even all of our subjective mental experiences were variations of static. Evolution is concerned with the right kinds of behavior, not with the subjective mental experiences that get associated with physical brain states. So evolution doesn't actually help explain the problem. Returning now to Jordan's video, it's simply false that there's no evidence for God. I've just outlined one very strong piece of evidence, and keep in mind that this is just one example. There are many data points that philosophers of religion point to that raise the probability of theism. For example, the beginning of the universe, contingency, moral knowledge, fine-tuning, consciousness, and on and on. The point of this video isn't to cover all of those data points. For that, you can just watch the other 500 plus videos on my channel. I've also got additional resources linked in the description for your convenience. Well, that's all I've got for you in this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of it. Try your best not to get your information about reality from TikTok. And remember, Christianity is true.
So until anyone can provide any tangible evidence to support a God claim, it won't be entertained.